They said the desert had only two gifts to offer: silence and death. But when a battle-worn cowboy followed his limping horse through a canyon of blistered stone, he stumbled upon something no map had ever dared to mark: a hidden waterfall, silver as moonlight roaring behind walls of rock. It should have been salvation. Instead, what waited beyond the veil of water was a truth so strange, so impossible, it would haunt him forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The desert did not forgive. It did not care for men or horses, or the weight of memory carried between them. It stretched endless and merciless across the horizon, a sheet of blistered gold that shimmered beneath the sun. Midday light burned down like a forge, and the wind did not cool, but scoured each gust, lifting grit into the air until it cut against exposed skin like the edge of a knife. Heat rose in waves, bending the distance, turning every ridge into a false promise. There was no shade, no tree or brush to break the monotony. Not even a vulture circled overhead. The land itself seemed to whisper, "This is where things come to die." Elias Carter rode through it, hunched in the saddle, a solitary figure swallowed by that vast, indifferent furnace. Each step of his horse sank into loose sand, leaving behind dark impressions that would be filled and erased within minutes by the restless wind. The sound of hooves was muffled by the shifting ground, steady but heavy, like the pulse of a dying drum. Elias had known deserts before. He had crossed stretches of New Mexico on patrol, and the cavalry led men across scorched mesas, where even the rocks seemed to smolder. But this stretch of country felt different. It was not just barren. It was hostile, ancient, as if the land itself bore grudges. He adjusted the brim of his hat, and the leather cracked from years beneath the sun. Dust clung to the brim, dust clung to his coat, dust clung to his very skin. His duster had once been a proud shade of brown, but had faded into something between sand and ash. The revolver at his side was no longer polished silver, but worn steel, the grip dark with sweat. He looked every bit the drifter he was: broad shoulders, thinned by hunger jaw, rough with stubble eyes, shadowed by exhaustion. There had been a time when Elias Carter belonged to something. The 7th Cavalry had given him orders, a flag, and brothers in arms who watched his back. He had seen too much in those years: men cut down in ambushes, comrades bleeding out in dust. Too many graves dug in foreign soil, too many names carved into wooden crosses no one would visit twice. When he left the army, he carried more ghosts than belongings. Now he had no home to return to. No family waited. Just the open country and the gnawing silence of memory. He drifted from town to town, trading labor for food, selling his aim with a rifle, when men wanted to keep cattle safe or bandits at bay. He was a cowboy by trade, but more than that, he was a man without a place. The desert had a way of making that truth heavier with each passing mile. Beside him, his only true companion stumbled, but did not falter. Dusty was a rangy horse, the color of sun-baked earth, his coat once sleek, but now dulled by sweat and sand. The gelding had carried Elias through more than battles, through lonely trails, storms, and long nights, when there was no one to talk to but the stars. But now Dusty bore a wound of his own. Days earlier, in the treacherous rocks of a dry wash, the horse had slipped. A jagged edge tore into his hind leg, leaving a gash that still seeped when the weight pressed wrong. Every few strides, Dusty favored the leg, a falter in his rhythm, a jolt through Elias's weary frame. The horse's breathing came harsh, nostrils flaring, red foam flecking the corners of his mouth. Sweat streaked the coat, running dark in lines that made him look half-carved from shadow. Elias knew what mercy looked like out here. He'd seen men put down their horses with a single shot, rather than let them suffer, rather than feed coyotes when collapse came. More than once in the last day, the thought pressed against him. His hand even rested on the butt of the revolver, once thumb brushing the hammer. But then Dusty lifted his head, ears pricking, eyes fixed with something that burned brighter than pain. It was defiance. It was will. And Elias, who had buried too many comrades who lost their fight, could not bring himself to snuff out that flame. Not when it still shone in the eyes of the only creature that had never left his side. The cowboy's canteen swung empty at his hip. When he lifted it, only a swallow rattled inside a last mercy measured in drops. He had rationed carefully, but the desert burned water from the body faster than any discipline could hold. His lips cracked until blood touched his tongue, his skin peeled beneath the sun, and each breath rasped like swallowing sand. Sweat had dried hours ago, leaving salt in streaks down his neck. Every muscle in him screamed to stop, to slip from the saddle and let the desert finish its work, to lay his bones down among the countless nameless that the sands had claimed. And yet, his father's voice rose in the silence, a memory more vivid than the mirages that rippled across the horizon. The desert don't forgive, boy. It don't care about courage or prayers. It'll strip you bare, take your water, take your breath, and leave you with nothing but bones. Only one way to beat it: keep walking. Always keep walking. The words rang in Elias's skull louder than the buzzing in his ears. He shifted in the saddle, every joint aching, and forced his eyes forward. The horizon wavered, hills rising and falling in false shapes. Every dune looked like the last. He thought he saw the water glimmering, once a silver pool, but when Dusty carried him closer, it dissolved into nothing but light. The desert mocked him with illusions, ghosts of salvation just out of reach. His chest heaved, his heart stuttered. Each inhale felt smaller, tighter. He wanted to give in. And then he looked at Dusty. The horse stumbled, yes. The horse bled, yes. But Dusty's head stayed high, ears flicking forward, nostrils quivering as if scenting something only he could sense. The gelding pressed on hooves, dragging but steady, pulling man and saddle into distances where no sane soul would walk. Elias leaned forward, hand pressed to the horse's damp neck. Beneath the sweat and hide, he felt the heart pounding strong, relentless. That rhythm spoke louder than despair. "You're still walking?" he whispered, voice cracked raw. "Then I ain't quitting either." The words weren't just a promise. They were surrender to the stubborn will of the animal who refused to stop. Elias had led Dusty through battle's river storms. Now Dusty led him. He sat straighter, tightened the cinch of the saddle, and steadied the reins. His revolver weighed at his side, not as a death sentence for the horse, but as a last resort for whatever might come. The sun bled toward evening shadows, stretching long across dunes, but they moved, still mane and beast, one will fused by desperation. Behind them, their trail already began to vanish, swallowed by shifting sand. Ahead lay only more heat, more silence, more trial. But Elias did not bow his head. Not now. In the endless desert, their figures were nothing, two specks swallowed by eternity. Yet in those specks burned a defiance greater than the land itself. Somewhere ahead, Dusty believed there was something worth finding. And for now, that was enough. The desert swallowed the last of the light in slow, merciless degrees. Elias Carter had been riding for hours beyond what his body wanted, beyond what his mind thought he could endure, until even Dusty's faltering stride became too much. At last, as the sun dipped low and bled red across the sand, Elias felt his body give way. His chest seized each breath a stab beneath his ribs, and his vision blurred with spots of white. He slid from the saddle, in a graceless collapse. His knees buckled and the weight of him carried both man and horse forward until he sprawled in the sand. The ground that had been scorching beneath the sun's tyranny now felt cool against his face, and that coolness tempted him more than water. He pressed his cheek to it, arms limp at his sides, and thought dimly that it might not be so bad to rest here forever. Above him, the bruised sky faded into a deeper indigo. The fire of sunset retreated, surrendering the horizon to darkness. Stars began to pinprick overhead, cold and uncaring. Elias's breath rattled out in shallow bursts as his body trembled, drained beyond command. He thought of simply closing his eyes and letting night sweep him away, not with dreams, but with the silence of never waking. Sleep came, but it came jagged, broken. His body twitched against the sand, each spasm pulling him briefly into wakefulness before plunging him back into feverish half-dreams. Memories twisted with hallucinations, the blinding glare of daylight, the wavering line of distant dunes, the faces of men he'd buried long ago. Then came the sound that pierced even the fog of his stupor, a long, mournful howl. It rose thin and sharp across the empty flats, echoing off unseen ridges. Another followed deeper, answering from farther away. Wolves. Their voices rolled across the desert like spectral choirs, neither near nor far, but always closer in the imagination than they truly were. Elias stirred, his lips cracked as he tried to wet them. The sound dug beneath his ribs, stirred something primal. He had seen what wolves could do to the carcass of a steer in less than an hour. He had seen them follow weak riders across a barren plains, patient shadows waiting for collapse. Now their voices seemed aimed at him, at the wounded man who lay helpless in the sand. Half lost in delirium, he imagined bones whitening under the desert moon, ribs jutting like fence posts, the wind sifting his remains into silence. He saw pale hands clutching canteens that had long since gone dry. He saw nameless riders whose stories ended not with gunfire or glory, but with thirst. His father's voice came unbidden, reminding him of such tales, warning him as a boy never to underestimate what emptiness could take. Every howl dragged him closer to that edge, as though the wolves themselves were reeling him in. Through it all, Dusty did not lie down. The gelding stood sentinel beside his fallen rider, injured leg, trembling but planted firm in the sand. He shifted his weight carefully, balancing strength against pain, yet he did not falter. His ears pricked toward the distant howls, swiveling to track unseen movements. His nostrils flared, drawing in every scent on the wind. Every so often, Dusty lowered his head to Elias, breathing heavily against the man's cheek. The warm gust stirred Elias from the brink of deeper unconsciousness, like a hand shaking him back from surrender. The horse's dark eyes reflected starlight's small lanterns in the void. The contrast was stark. Where Elias had crumpled, surrendering to fatigue and despair, Dusty remained upright, defiant. Wounded though he was, the horse bore himself with more resolve than the man he carried. In that moment, the roles seemed reversed, the animal strong, the man weak, the beast watchful, the master helpless. It was a silent guardianship, as if Dusty had taken on the duty of soldier while his rider lay broken. In the haze of his restless sleep, Elias heard another voice. It was not the wolves, nor the desert wind, but the steady, familiar timbre of his father. Out here, sun men don't find water horses do. The words drifted like smoke through the dreamscape, heavy and certain. Elias saw himself again as a boy trudging through the sands, with a hand too small wrapped around a leather rein. His father walked beside a tall bay mare, pointing to the flick of her ears, the way her head angled into the wind. Trust the animal, the older Carter had said. They'll smell life where we can't. They'll sense the earth's secrets long before a man's eyes ever catch them. You listen to your horse, and he'll lead you further than your own 2 feet ever could. The memory shimmered with heat-haze clarity, painful and comforting all at once. His father's rough hand on his shoulder. The certainty of a lesson that had seemed simple then, but rang like a gospel now with his own life hanging in the balance. Elias stirred, dragging open one eye. The world was a blur of stars, overhead scattered like shattered glass across the black dome of the sky. He turned his head weakly and found Dusty still there, upright, steady eyes bright. The horse's silhouette against the starlight was proud despite the limp in his leg ears forward, as though listening to something Elias could not hear. His hide glistened with sweat, yet he did not lower himself to the ground. He stood because that was what was required. A flicker sparked in Elias's chest. A fragile, trembling spark, but real. If the horse could endure, then so could he. If Dusty still sensed some call in the distance, water shelter salvation, then Elias had no right to lay down and surrender. He wet his lips with the ghost of a smile and rasped, barely above a whisper, "I'll trust you, boy. You lead, I'll follow." Dusty's ears twitched at the sound, and for a moment Elias fancied that the horse understood. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter around himself, curling on the sand. The wolves howled again, distant and wild, but their voices seemed less damning now. Between him and them stood a guardian of hide and bone, scarred but unbroken. Elias let his eyes close, not in surrender, but in trust. For the first time in days, sleep came with something gentler than fear. Hope, thin as a thread, faint as starlight, settled into his chest as he drifted off. The first light came not with triumph, but with quiet indifference. Dawn unfurled slowly over the desert, spilling faint pink across the edge of the horizon, a fragile band of color clinging to the black sky. The air still bit dry against the skin, but it lacked the merciless fire of noon. For the first time in days, Elias Carter felt coolness on his cheeks instead of the lash of heat. He stirred from the shallow sleep that had gripped him, limbs stiff, muscles heavy as stone. When he tried to move, his body resisted, groaning with pain. His lips had split in the night. When he licked at them, the taste of blood mixed with salt. His throat burned raw and narrow, every swallow a struggle. The canteen lay beside him in the sand. He lifted it with trembling fingers, shook it, and heard the faintest rattle inside, mere drops, not enough to slake thirst, only enough to remind him how little remained. He tilted it, caught the last dribble against his tongue, and closed his eyes at the fleeting relief. "One more day, boy," he whispered hoarsely, the words rasping like gravel. He turned his gaze toward Dusty, who stood nearby, ears flicking sides, heaving with slow breaths. Just one more. The horse shifted his weight, lowering his muzzle toward Elias, as if he had heard and understood. Elias pressed a hand into the sand, forced himself upright, and clung to the saddle horn until the world steadied. With the rising sun, he would have to move again. Stopping too long meant death, and Dusty seemed unwilling to stop. The trail resumed, hooves dragging through the early morning hush. With each step, Elias leaned forward, half slumped over the saddle, eyes narrowed against the brightness spreading over the desert. Then he noticed it. The wind. It carried something different now. It no longer came as a furnace blast, all grit and salt, but brushed against him with a trace of dampness, thin as the breath of dawn fog. Elias froze, tugging gently at the reins. Dust clung to his lashes as he lifted his face and inhaled. Moisture. It was faint, almost imagined. But it was there, soft, elusive, a promise hidden in the air. His hands shook against the leather. He dared not trust it. How many times had weary men chased scents that weren't there, followed the ghost of water until they fell lifeless into the sand? He closed his eyes, drew in another breath, and tried again. Yes, he was sure. The dryness of the desert was cracked open by something wetter, something alive. A memory stirred, the kind that belonged to younger days, walking at his father's side. The old man had told him once, "The desert's cruel, but it can't hide its secrets. When the air changes, son, life is near. Don't ignore it. Don't doubt it." Elias gritted his teeth, gripping the horn tighter. If his father was right, if his instincts weren't playing tricks, then something waited ahead, beyond the horizon's mirages. The hours pushed them onward. Slowly, the desert began to change its face. The rolling dunes smoothed out, and patches of stone appeared scattered like islands against the sea of sand. The ground grew harder beneath Dusty's hooves, a rough crunch of gravel replacing the muffled sink of powder. Here and there, shards of rock jutted through, glinting in the sun with mica spark. Elias reined in the horse and slipped down from the saddle. His boots scraped against the uneven ground knees, stiff as he crouched to run a hand along the stone. He lifted a fragment, a jagged piece, cool against his palm, still holding the night's memory of chill. For a moment he pressed it against his cheek, reveling in that lingering coolness. "Not just sand anymore," he muttered under his breath. "And sand don't keep secrets." He looked up toward the ragged rise of distant ridges. But stone can hide water. Dusty tossed his head, as if in answer, snorting at the air. The desert's monotony was breaking, revealing cracks where life might cling. Elias felt something stir in him, small but undeniable hope. By mid-morning, his eyes caught it, a glimmer faint and green. At first, he thought it was another mirage, a cruel jest of the light. A thin thread of color against the pale world so insubstantial, he blinked twice, certain it would vanish. It didn't. There it was again. A streak of green etched along the base of a far-off cliff, fragile as a brushstroke on stone. Elias rubbed at his eyes, cursed the heat, squinted until they watered. It had to be illusion. He had heard the stories wanderers, who thought they saw groves on the horizon, ran until their hearts burst only to fall face first into more sand. He had seen men cry out to lakes that weren't there, crawl across the ground with fingers digging furrows before silence claimed them. His pulse raced, hammering harder than his breath. If it was false, if the desert was mocking him, he didn't know if he could survive the disappointment. Yet the sun climbed higher, and still the green remained. It did not shimmer away like water's deceit. The line of it clung stubborn to the cliff, not bending to the mirage's dance. Elias's chest tightened, not just with thirst, but with fear. What if this hope was real? What if it was the first true sign of life since endless miles of death? Dusty's reaction came before Elias could decide. The gelding stiffened beneath him, muscles quivering, ears pricked like spears toward the unseen horizon. He flared his nostrils, inhaled sharply, and then surged forward with renewed vigor. His injured leg faltered, but determination drove him onward, pace quickening despite the limp. Elias gripped the reins, startled. Easy boy, steady, but Dusty paid no mind to restraint. The horse's instincts had taken command, pulling them along with urgent certainty. The cowboy could only hold on, jostled in the saddle, his exhaustion colliding with sudden adrenaline. A strange mix of pride and dread knotted in his chest. Pride because Dusty's will burned brighter than his own. Dread because the horse might chase a phantom until they both collapsed. Still, Elias could not deny what he saw in Dusty's eyes, that same fire of belief, unyielding, almost fierce. It was not desperation alone that carried him forward, it was purpose. And for the first time, Elias admitted to himself that perhaps the horse knew more than he did. The desert rolled out before them, harsh and pitiless, but something within it had changed. Elias slumped against the saddle horn, every ounce of strength bleeding into his grip on the leather. His voice cracked when he spoke little more than breath. "You know something I don't you, boy?" Dusty flicked an ear back at the sound and then pressed harder into the stride, as if answering. Elias let his hands fall slack, giving up the illusion of control. He laid his weight against the saddle, surrendered to the horse's guidance, and closed his eyes for a heartbeat. There was a moment, brief but clear, when fear loosened its hold. He no longer felt like a man staggering through death's embrace, but like a passenger carried toward a destiny he could not yet see. Faith, fragile and unsteady, rooted itself in him. Faith not in himself, but in the animal that had borne him through fire and hunger, that stood watch when he could not, that now pulled him forward as though following a map written in instinct. He breathed out slowly words, no louder than a prayer you lead I'll follow. And for the first time in endless days, the path ahead felt less like doom and more like possibility. The canyon tightened around them like a throat. Elias guided Dusty into the narrow cut between walls of stone, where the cliffs pressed close on either side and stole the wind from the air. The horse's hooves struck sparks against the rock, echoing sharply in the confined passage. Sand had given way entirely now to gravel and stone, and the path wound like a scar through the bones of the desert. At first, Elias thought the sound was the wind, a low moan, distant hollow threading through the cracks of stone. But as they pressed further, the sound grew fuller, deeper, carrying a rhythm that wind could not mimic. His head tilted, brow furrowing as realization crept into him. That was not the song of air. It was water. The sound swelled with each step, drumming against the walls until it seemed to pulse through his ribs. Elias leaned forward, clutching the horn, his lips parting, as a strange tremor coursed through him. He hadn't heard such a sound in so long he'd almost forgotten it. Moisture touched his face, soft as breath. The air had changed. It was cool now, laden with dampness. Elias's throat ached at the sensation, craving what it promised. His pulse leapt. Could it be? He whispered hoarsely, barely daring to voice the thought. Hope stirred violently inside him, fragile and dangerous. In the desert, hope was often more deadly than thirst. But he could not turn away from the sound that beckoned. Dusty quickened his pace, ears pricked, nostrils flaring at the scent of water. The gelding limped, but pressed forward, eagerly dragging Elias toward the growing roar. The canyon opened without warning. Elias squinted against the sudden burst of light as the narrow walls gave way to a clearing. The brightness struck like a blow, dazzling after the dim confines of stone. He lifted an arm to shield his eyes, blinking hard. And then he saw it. A waterfall. It thundered down from a jagged cliff, a towering sheet of white that poured into a pool as clear and green as polished glass. Spray erupted at the base, filling the air with mist that shimmered in the sunlight. The sound was immense, a constant roar that seemed to wash the desert silence from his ears. Elias sat frozen in the saddle, staring, scarcely able to breathe. For days, the world had been nothing but death, sand heat, emptiness. Now here, life cascaded from stone itself. The mist bent sunlight into a faint rainbow that arched across the pool. Grass grew thick at the water's edge, lush and swaying. Shrubs and wildflowers clung to the rocks, their colors vivid against the gray cliffs. Birds wheeled above the spray, their cries sharp and jubilant. It was a vision so sudden, so impossibly vibrant, that Elias thought for an instant he must have gone mad and stumbled into a dream. His throat tightened. Words scraped out of him, reverent and broken silver veil. Looks like heaven's curtain. Dusty needed no urging. The horse lunged forward, half limping, half running, driven by the desperate need that had carried him across miles of torment. He plunged toward the water's edge, dragging Elias in his saddle until the cowboy slid free, stumbling as his boots sank into soft grass. The gelding lowered his head and drove his muzzle into the pool, drinking with greedy gulps. Water streamed down his jaw, soaking the ground. He snorted between swallows, pawing at the edge with frantic relief. Elias fell to his knees beside him, scooped water into his trembling hands, and drank. The first swallow nearly choked him with its coldness, a shock that stabbed his chest, but he forced it down and drank again and again until the ache in his throat eased. Tears burned behind his eyes as water ran down his chin. He pitched forward, pressing his face to the surface, letting the pool wash across his mouth and cheeks. The chill bit him, and it felt like salvation. When at last he dragged himself back, gasping, he lay flat on the grass and stared upward. Above him, the sky was scattered with drifting white clouds, delicate and slow. He could not remember the last time he had seen them. For days it had been nothing but a hard dome of fire. Now to see clouds, to see softness, it undid him. His breath slowed. His heart eased its frantic pounding. Muscles that had been knots of pain unwound against the cool earth. A laugh escaped him, hoarse and broken, but a laugh nonetheless. He was alive. Dusty was alive. And they had found paradise, hidden in the heart of hell. Time seemed to blur as he lay there. Minutes or hours he could not tell. The world was narrowed to the grass beneath him, the mist against his face, the steady roar of water that drowned every other thought. But as his senses returned, Elias began to notice details beyond relief. Something was strange. He pushed himself upright, still swaying with exhaustion, and looked back toward the falls. Behind the crashing torrent of silver, a darkness stirred. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of shadow, the contrast between light and stone. But the longer he stared, the clearer it became. There was space behind the water, a hollow black and unbroken where the curtain of spray thinned and revealed not solid cliff, but emptiness. Elias narrowed his eyes. The pool reflected shards of light upward, illuminating glimpses of what lay beyond the cascade. It was not the jagged face of rock he expected. It was a void, a gap wide enough for a man to pass through if he dared. A prickle crawled the length of his spine. He took a cautious step closer, boots squelching in damp earth. Mist clung to his lashes, beads of water running down his beard. The roar of the falls swelled until it smothered every other sound. No birds, no wind, no voice, but its own. He felt as though he had stepped into a separate world, cut off by the veil of silver. Dusty raised his head from the pool water, dripping from his muzzle. The horse snorted uneasily, ears flicking back toward the noise. He pawed the ground, restless, as though sensing something beyond that Elias could not yet see. The cowboy's pulse quickened. His throat, though quenched, felt dry again. He murmured under his breath, words swallowed by the thunder, "Behind every curtain there's a stage. What's behind you? Silver veil." His eyes locked on the darkness, hidden within the waterfall. And in that moment, relief gave way to curiosity, and curiosity edged into dread. The roar of the waterfall swallowed everything. Elias Carter stood at the edge of the pool, boots sinking into wet grass, eyes fixed on the curtain of white water before him. The mist clung to his skin, dripping from his beard, cooling him after days of fire and thirst. But now the water's promise of salvation no longer consumed him. What consumed him was the darkness behind it. It was no trick of the light. He could see it clearly now, a hollow of void hidden within the wall of stone, concealed by the thunderous sheet of silver. He swallowed, chest tightening. Something waited there. He drew a long, steady breath, then pulled his hat lower on his brow. With one arm, he shielded his face and stepped forward. The waterfall struck like a blow. Cold slammed against him, shocking after the furnace of the desert. He gasped as the torrent pummeled his shoulders and chest, water hammering into his clothes, drenching him instantly. The noise was deafening. 1,000 drums pounding against his ears, rattling in his skull. He gritted his teeth and pushed on boots, sliding against slick rock, hand groping along the wall for balance. One step, then another. Until suddenly the pressure eased and he stumbled through. On the other side, the roar dulled into echo. Darkness swallowed him whole, pierced only by the faint shimmer of water still streaming down his arms. He froze, disoriented, chest heaving. It was as though he had stepped not just behind a curtain of water, but out of one world and into another. Outside, dusty, whinnied hooves clattering against stone. The gelding stood at the pool's edge, ears pinned, body trembling. He did not follow. Elias glanced back, once saw the horse's silhouette framed in white spray, and understood. The animal would not cross. This was a step he had to take alone. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with the musk of stone. Each breath carried the tang of moss and rot, the kind of smell that clung to earth, untouched by sun for ages. Elias reached into his coat pocket, drew out a match, and struck it against the wall. The spark flared, sputtered, then caught spilling weak light into the cavern. The flame quivered in the draft, revealing slick walls of dark rock wet with dripping water. Droplets fell in steady rhythm, splashing softly against the ground, a metronome beneath the echo of the falls. Elias stepped carefully, boots crunching over gravel, slick with moisture. The air bit through his soaked clothes, raising goose flesh along his arms. It felt like walking into the lungs of the earth. He held the match aloft, watching its glow glance off surfaces that seemed too smooth to be natural. The walls here bore lines, flat planes, and edges that suggested more than mere erosion. His stomach tightened. This place had not been shaped by water alone. The match burned down, singeing his fingers. He hissed, shook it out, then lit another. The tiny flame felt pitiful against the cavern's vast throat, but it was enough to push the darkness back, one hesitant step at a time. He ventured deeper, ears straining. The roar of the falls dulled to a rumble, replaced by the drip and plink of unseen streams. Each sound magnified, bouncing in eerie harmony through the chamber. The deeper he went, the more certain he became. This place had held people once. The matchlight caught on something unusual. At first, it looked like nothing more than a scatter of black across the stone. But as Elias crouched closer, the shape revealed itself, the ashen remnants of fire. Char and soot etched into the floor, brittle and dry, long cold. His chest tightened. He touched it with a gloved hand, and the flakes crumbled instantly, as though they had waited centuries for his touch to finish their decay. He straightened slowly, the flame of the match swinging wide across the cavern. There, another glint. Metal dull and corroded, lying in the shadows. He moved closer, breath shallow. A rifle. Or what had once been a rifle. The barrel bent, the stock split, the steel coated with red rust. He picked it up and felt it disintegrate in his hands, dropping fragments to the floor. A few steps farther, and he found a chest. Or rather, the skeleton of one. Wood-rotted iron bands, eaten through the structure, collapsed. Among its remains gleamed the faint curve of silver coins, dulled and spotted, but unmistakable. Elias crouched again, picking one up. It was rough in his hand, the etching worn almost smooth. He rubbed it with his thumb and saw the outline of an eagle, ghostly but present. His pulse quickened. The match flickered against the wall nearby, and he saw something stranger still. Marks. Gouges carved into the rock, crude and jagged. Lines intersecting in symbols he could not place. A spiral, a cross-hatched circle, a cluster of triangles. They were no random scratches. They meant something once. Perhaps to warn, perhaps to guide, perhaps only to remember. Elias's breath caught. He rose, turning in a slow circle as the flame guttered. Relics of men left in the bowels of the earth behind a veil of water no sane wanderer would have thought to breach. He swallowed hard. The match hissed out, leaving him in total darkness. He struck another with shaking hands, eager to banish the void. Light returned, and with it came the rush of thought. God Almighty, he whispered. His voice sounded small, thin in the cavern's belly. He tightened his grip on the match, knuckles white. No one back home would believe this. His heart pounded hard enough to make him dizzy. He had expected nothing behind the falls, perhaps a hollow, perhaps stone. Not this. Not ashes, not guns, not coins, not marks cut by human hands. He stared at the crude carvings on the wall, running his fingers over the grooves. Were they warnings, stories, the last words of men who never escaped? He imagined them huddled here, listening to the same roar of water, tending the same fire whose ash now stained his gloves. Who were they, settlers, bandits, soldiers on the run? Did they leave by choice, or did they die here in the dark? The possibilities twisted through him like smoke, impossible to hold. A shiver crawled over his skin. He realized suddenly how deep the silence pressed. The waterfall's voice had dulled, but the cavern had its own heartbeat, a tension that made his spine stiffen. He felt the eyes of ghosts in the shadows. He wanted to go deeper and feared it all the same. Dusty's cry saved him. It came muffled through the wall of water, a sharp, uneasy whinny that echoed faintly into the cavern. Elias spun the match, sputtering his pulse, hammering. The horse was still outside, waiting, watching. Elias exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He moved back toward the waterfall, the flames shivering in his grip. As he reached the veil of spray, he could see the silhouette beyond it, the outline of his horse standing rigid at the pool's edge, head high, ears alert. The gelding pawed the ground, nervously striking sparks against stone. He shook his mane water, flying, and let out another sound lower this time, almost a plea. Elias pressed a hand to the wet rock beside him. He had seen Dusty endure agony without flinching, carry him across barren miles on a torn leg. Yet here, the horse would not follow. That alone told him something. He lingered, watching the creature he trusted more than any man. In the silver haze of the falls, Dusty's eyes glimmered with unease, wide and white. Easy boy Elias, murmured his voice, muffled by the roar. I'll be back. He touched the brim of his hat, the words almost drowned. But this place has more than water. And with that he turned his gaze back into the cavern, torn between dread and wonder, between the urge to flee and the hunger to know. Behind him, Dusty shifted restless. Ahead, darkness stretched full of secrets the desert had buried, and which the waterfall had guarded for God knew how long. Night crept down the canyon like a tide of ink. The roar of the Silver Veil waterfall never ceased, a constant thunder rolling across the pool and echoing against the stone walls. To Elias Carter, it sounded almost like a heartbeat, a monstrous, unending pulse that filled the valley and claimed the silence for itself. As twilight bled away, he gathered what little dry brush and branches he could find, scattered near the pool's edge. They were damp, slick with spray. but he coaxed them into a pile against the rock face and struck steel against flint. Sparks leapt, hissed, caught. Smoke curled upward, thin and hesitant, until at last a tongue of flame licked at the kindling and spread with sudden hunger. The fire rose, crackling its light, throwing Elias's shadow long and grotesque against the wet walls. The flame fractured across droplets of water clinging to the stone, scattering the glow into 100 tiny sparks. For the first time since stepping into this place, the darkness retreated. The chill damp of the cavern eased. Elias sank near the blaze, shrugging off his soaked coat and laying it across a rock to dry. Steam rose from the fabric. His shoulders sagged, his body heavy with exhaustion, but warmth seeped slowly back into him, loosening the ache that had gripped his muscles since the desert. He drew in a deep breath, let it out, and for the first time in days, it did not scrape his lungs raw. Dusty lay stretched along the pool's edge, forelegs folded neatly. His sides, rising and falling in the rhythm of a tired but steady heart. Moonlight fractured by spray painted the gelding's hide with a pale shimmer. Steam curled from his muzzle as he breathed soft, white plumes rising in the cool night air. Elias crawled closer, crouching to examine the torn flesh on the horse's hind leg. The swelling had eased, no longer angry and inflamed, as it had been in the desert. The constant chill of water and mist had drawn out the heat, soothing what days before might have turned to rot. Relief loosened Elias's chest. "You did good, boy," he murmured, running his hand through the gelding's damp mane. His voice cracked raw from thirst and smoke. "Real good." Dusty flicked an ear, but did not rise. He only turned his dark eyes toward his master and exhaled long and steady, as if content that his work was done. Elias stayed there for a moment, his hand resting against the horse's neck, marveling at the strange reversal of fate. Out there in the wasteland of sun and sand, the desert had tried to break them both. Here in the hidden hollow, the horse lay in peace, while his master struggled to make sense of it. Dusty, once a war mount who had thundered beneath cannon smoke, had become a sentinel of survival, and Elias realized he would not be alive without him. Later, hunger crept into his belly, not the gnawing emptiness of the desert, but a gentle reminder that he could eat again. He left the fire long enough to forage near the bank, plucking berries he had seen growing among the rocks. Their skin burst tart against his tongue. He combined them with the last scraps of dried meat from his saddlebag, chewing slowly, deliberately, as if afraid the meal would vanish if he rushed it. The water from the pool scooped into his hands and poured down his throat was sweeter than any whiskey he had ever tasted. It filled him with a dizzying rush of strength. He leaned back on his haunches, laughing suddenly, the sound rough but real. "This is it," he rasped to the night eyes shining in the firelight. "We made it." The camp was a picture from some old tale firelight. Licking against the rocks, the horse stretched in quiet ease the waterfall, casting mist that shimmered like silver thread. Elias stared into it, struck by the thought that he had stumbled not into mere salvation, but into a kind of myth. An oasis no map had ever shown, a secret preserved by the desert's cruelty. He tilted his head back, watching sparks from the fire rise and vanish against the night. And for the first time since the war, he allowed himself to smile without bitterness. But the desert was not the only thing that haunted this place. Later, when the fire had burned low, Elias rose to fetch more wood. He skirted the pool, boots sinking in damp soil. The night air carried a scent beyond moss and smoke, something acrid, sharp, lingering. His eyes caught it then, a depression in the earth, faint but clear beneath the moonlight. He crouched. It was not the mark of hoof or paw. It was the shape of a boot. Human. The print was shallow, blurred by time and moisture, but it was there. He brushed his fingers across it, cold mud clinging to his glove. His pulse spiked. Not far from it, stones had been arranged in a circle blackened by fire. He touched them, felt the brittle crumble of ash. Old, long dead, but human-made. Someone had once sat here warming themselves by their own blaze, listening to the same thunder of the falls. Elias stared into the cold ring heart pounding. The realization cut through him like ice. This was no untouched paradise. Others had been here. Perhaps long ago. Perhaps not long enough. His thoughts tumbled over one another. Who were they, travelers like him, saved by accident? Outlaws hiding from the law scouts? Did they leave willingly, or did the earth claim them? The pool that had seemed holy now shimmered with unease. The cavern walls seemed to close tighter. Elias rose slowly, eyes scanning the dark hand, drifting unconsciously toward the revolver on his hip. When he returned to the fire, Dusty had lifted his head, ears pricked, watching him. With eyes that glinted in the glow, the horse's body was tense, his breath faster. He felt it too, the intrusion of something unseen. Elias sank to the ground beside him, resting one hand against the gelding's warm neck. The fire snapped sparks, jumping shadows, writhing on the stone. "We're not the first ones here, Dusty," he whispered, his throat tight. The words trembled with awe and dread. The horse blinked, a low rumble rising in his chest, half snort, half warning. Elias stroked his neck slowly, calming them both. He shifted the revolver in its holster, the familiar weight steadying him, his gaze fixed on the waterfall beyond the firelight. Silver water cascaded endlessly, masking whatever secrets lay within its heart. The night stretched long. The blaze sputtered, recovered, sputtered again. Elias sat awake, body rigid, though exhaustion pressed heavy. He knew sleep would not come easily, not with footprints in the mud. Not with ashes cold, but undeniable. Not with the knowledge that this hidden sanctuary belonged to others once and might again. Gratitude still beat in his chest, fierce and undeniable. The place had saved his life, but woven through it now was a thread of fear. Paradise was never free, and paradise discovered was never safe. So he sat with his horse, the firelight flickering across his tired face, the thunder of the silver veil drowning every whisper of the night, and waited for dawn with eyes that refused to close. Dawn crept softly into the hidden valley, turning mist into threads of gold. Elias Carter sat on a rock near the fire's ashes elbows, resting on his knees, staring at the waterfall as the morning light broke across its silver veil. He hadn't slept more than a handful of minutes, his nerves pulled taut by what he had seen the night before, the boot prints and the ring of old stones, the truth that others had once found this place. The thought gnawed at him now as the spray drifted over his face. If someone had been here before, someone could come again. The desert beyond was ruthless, but he had seen how men could carve the land for their own greed streams, dried to mud forests, hacked down soil, split open for gold and silver. The West was a machine that took what it wanted and left only scars. What would happen if others learned of this oasis? They would strip it bare, trample it flat, turn its miracle into another graveyard. Elias's jaw tightened. If this place is found, he muttered to himself, it dies. The words landed heavy, and with them came clarity. This valley, this waterfall, this sanctuary, it could not belong to anyone but him and Dusty. Its secret had to be carried only between them. By mid-morning, he climbed the narrow path through the rocks that led back toward the desert. The air shimmered with heat, there dry, as a furnace reminding him of how close death still lay beyond the cliffs. He looked back into the cleft, at the shadow where the passage vanished, and set to work. He dragged branches and brush across the mouth of the trail, weaving them together to make it appear no more than a tumble of weeds. He lifted loose stones, stacking them into false rubble that blocked the way. Dust stung his eyes, sweat soaked his shirt, but he worked until his shoulders burned. When at last he stepped back, the path no longer looked like an entrance at all. It was as though the rock had closed upon itself. Only someone who knew exactly where to search might find the gap. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow, breathing hard. He let his hand rest against the stone, rough and warm beneath his palm, and whispered, "No one will take this from us." Then he turned, slipping back into the shadow of the cliffs, and the desert lost sight of him once again. Back by the pool, Elias felt the urge to make more than camp. He needed shelter. Something that could hold against rain and wind, something that could last longer than a single night. He gathered fallen branches and saplings from the fringes of the glade, lashed them together with strips of rawhide from his gear. Slowly, he built a frame against the stone wall, draping it with the worn canvas of his bedroll and a strip of horsehide he had carried since the war. It was clumsy, awkward, but it stood. He built his fire pit tight against the cliff where the smoke would rise and vanish into the mist of the waterfall. Anyone beyond the veil would never see it. When he stepped back, wiping dirt from his hands, the makeshift hut looked pitiful compared to the cabins he'd once known. Yet here in the belly of the desert, it was more than shelter. It was a claim, a foothold. Elias sat down on the grass outside it, exhaustion pulling at him. And for the first time since leaving the army, he felt a weight ease from his chest. Dusty's leg had stiffened during the morning, but the gelding stood steady enough to graze on the thick grass near the pool. Elias fetched a strip of cloth, tore it from his own shirt, and knelt to bind the wound after rinsing it with handfuls of cold water. The horse flinched, but did not fight him. "You saved me, now I'll save you," Elias murmured, tying the knot firm but gentle. He stroked the horse's shoulder, feeling the warmth of life beneath his palm. Day by day, he could see the change. Dusty's eyes had cleared, his breathing eased, the tremor in his limbs fading. He would recover here. Elias felt a surge of gratitude so fierce it startled him. Their survival was not luck, it was partnership. Man and horse bound together by more than necessity. Food had to come next. Hunger gnawed at him, though now it was sharp with energy, not despair. Elias carved rough stakes from fallen branches, sharpened them against stone until their tips gleamed. He set snares near the bushes, careful to mask his scent, and by dusk a rabbit trembled in his trap. He carried it back, gutted it quickly, and set the meat over his fire. The smell of roasting flesh filled the hollow, mingling with the fresh scent of moss and water. Elias's stomach cramped with anticipation. He ate slowly, savoring each bite juice running down his chin. It was not feast, but it was more than survival. And when he gathered berries from the edge of the stream to finish the meal, he laughed aloud at the absurdity of it. Days ago, he had thought to die nameless in the sand. Tonight, he had meat berries, water fire, and a roof of sorts over his head. The valley gave more than survival. It gave abundance, and he felt its lessons writing themselves into him. Learn the trees, learn the trails, watch the animals. Respect what gives life. That night, he sat cross-legged by the fire, Dusty drowsing nearby, the waterfall rumbling in its eternal voice. He stared at the flame and thought of what had brought him here. The war, the loneliness, the endless wandering. He had seen towns crumble, seen men ruin land for greed, seen rivers poisoned. But here in this hollow, there was no ruin, only renewal. Maybe this ain't just a stop. Elias whispered words spilling into the night. He paused, staring at the sparks drifting upward. Maybe it's a start. The thought clung to him, heavier than hunger, stronger than thirst. For years, he had only moved from one place to the next, never daring to call any land his own. But this place, it asked something different. It asked not to be taken, but to be guarded. And in return, it offered something like home. The decision settled over him the next morning. He woke with the sun, the fire dead, the air cool with mist. Dusty grazed nearby, strong enough to flick his tail lazily against flies. Elias rose, stretched his stiff limbs, and walked to the waterfall's edge. He laid a hand against the stone. It was slick with spray, ancient and unmoved by his presence. Yet he felt a connection in that moment, as if the place had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. "Silver Veil," he said softly. "You're mine, and I'm yours." He drew his knife from his belt, the steel nicked and scarred from years of use, and scratched a mark into the rock by his shelter. Just a small symbol, 2 lines, crossing simple silent. A claim that only he would understand. In his chest, something swelled that was not pride, but devotion. He looked toward Dusty, who raised his head, ears pricked. Elias crossed to him, resting his forehead briefly against the gelding's neck. "This ain't just where I survived, boy," he whispered. The horse shifted, steady and warm, beneath him. Elias closed his eyes. "This is where we live." The oath was made, not shouted, not carved in law, but bound in blood and breath. And as the waterfall thundered on, drowning the world beyond its veil, Elias Carter swore that the secret of Silver Veil would be his to guard until the day his body returned to the dust. For a few blessed days after his vow, Elias let the Silver Veil be nothing more than water and grass and sleep. He worked. He ate. He watched Dusty heal. And yet the darkness behind the waterfall did not loosen its hold on him. It was a picture that kept returning when he closed his eyes, the black mouth in the rock, the sense of a breath held for years. At night, lying under canvas with the fire guttering low, he would hear it. Not the roar that was constant, a great lung forever drawing in and thundering out, but the smaller notes beneath it. Taps, ticks, distant drips, counting time like an old clock. Sometimes the draft from the cave curled under the canvas and slid along his neck like a cold finger. The feeling grew until it colored his waking hours. He found himself glancing toward the curtain of water as he mended straps or checked snares, as if some unseen gaze watched back. Dusty disliked the falls now more than he had at first. The gelding would drink at the pool and graze nearby, but whenever Elias walked too close to the pale wall, the horse's skin quivered and his ears flattened. He would lift his head and stare at the silver sheet as if it might tear open. On the 4th evening, with the sun lowering and the spray turning to floating fire, Elias laid a hand on the horse's cheek and said, "We can't live beside a secret forever, boy." Dusty stood breathing slow and did not answer. That was the trouble with vows. Once made, they demanded consequence. Elias packed a torch wrapped in pitch, his knife, and his revolver. He checked the cylinder, spun it once, and slid it home. Then, with the last light falling off the cliffs and the hidden glade deepening toward dusk, he stepped into the pool's chill and faced the veil. The water struck him like it always did, hard and cold, driving breath from his chest. He leaned into it, felt the curtain pound his shoulders, and back the world narrowing to noise and weight and wet. Then the pressure dropped, and he stumbled through into the dark. The torch hissed when it caught the flame, guttering before it steadied and leaned with the draft. The light bled across rock slick with condensation and revealed the same chamber he had seen before. But tonight, he carried enough fire to push the shadows farther. He moved slowly, one hand skimming the wall boot soles, careful on the damp grit. Droplets fell in unending beats, tick, 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 the cave's quiet metronome. The air had a taste to it, metal rubbed with damp leather mold, old ash, and something faintly sour like breath trapped for too long. A chill draft flowed from deeper inside, drawn and released by the breathing of the falls. The passage narrowed until his shoulders brushed both sides. Then, as caves do, it let go all at once. He stepped from a throat into a chest, into a room hollowed by water and time, big enough to swallow a barn. He drove the torch into a crevice and wedged it there, flame, swinging shadows, flinging long limbs across the vaulted stone like giants waking. His heartbeat quickened, answering the drip with a clumsy cadence of its own. Nothing about the shapes at the chamber's edge looked born. They looked placed. He saw the first box before he believed it. It sat half-collapsed against a shelf of rock iron bands, eaten to lace by rust lid, split and leaning. He knelt, the old ache in his knees, flaring, and brushed aside rotted wood. The torch threw fire into the gap, and the light pooled along the dull yellow faces within. Not coins bars. Small ones, brick-thick, their edges corroded, and their surfaces blotched like diseased skin, but still unmistakable in their gravity. Elias reached in and lifted one. It was heavy in that particular way, only precious metal carried dense, reluctant to rise, wanting to fall back to earth. He felt the weight sink into his palm and absurdly thought of water. How the pool outside had filled his body with life. How this dense gleam now flooded him with a different kind of fever. Beside the chest lay a book bound in cracked leather edges, bloomed with mildew. He set the bar down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and pried the cover open. Pages lifted like brittle leaves. Ink had run where damp had bled through, but a hand remained awkward, impatient, slashing letters into legibility when neatness failed. June 18th. Left camp at sundown. Bishop's men were sleeping drunk. I took my share in the map and ran the wash until stars fell over the rim. Elias read by the skittering torch mouth, moving with the words. The writer spoke in staccato heat, fear, thirst, the drag of weight in the saddle, the need to hide where horses wouldn't scent. What he described fit this place too well. The water sings behind the rock. No hoof prints in, no hoof prints out. I put enough there to make a start somewhere north if I can keep the fever off. The hand deteriorated across pages, letters loosening, as if the joints that held them had gone soft. On a blank line near the back, ink pooled thick where the pen had been held too long. The last sentence slashed, crooked across it. The water sings, but it won't wash away my sins. Elias stared at the words until they swam. Somewhere in his chest, pity and unease tangled. The bars gleamed a little, accepting and indifferent. He set the journal down and backed away, the torch's heat prickling his eyes until tears or sweat blurred the world. This ain't just water, he whispered, the sentence rising like a fever he could not keep down. It's history, or a curse. He turned with the light, and the chamber changed again. The flame made different walls speak. What before had been shadow turned to ochre, to rust to the color of dry blood. Paint clung to rock where it had no right to last, pigments of clay and mineral ground, and fixed with fat or sapped the old alchemy of people who needed their stories to stay. The images were simple and sure. A line of dunes, each drawn with a quick hand. A sun no circle but a wheel with spokes that reached across the wall. And beneath it, a horse vast and elegant in its surety, its legs not merely running, but lifted, as if the ground itself rose to carry it. Above the horse, someone had painted wings. not feathered like a bird's, more like long strokes of light arcs that lifted from the withers, spilling backward. On the horse's back rode a figure with a spear arm, outstretched not to strike, but to point. Before them, a curve, a ribbon, a fall of pale lines, like hair, like rain, like water drawn, falling. Elias's throat closed. His fingers rose of their own accord, hovering just shy of the rock. Like they knew, he said, voice tin-deep with wonder. They knew we'd come. Whoever stood here had seen the desert and marked its hunger. They had seen salvation where rock and water wed. They had seen a rider and a horse crossing emptiness toward a veil that hid a heart. Perhaps not him, not Dusty, not this exact day, but the type of them, the story of them, which was older than both. The spirals scattered across the wall were not decoration. They were paths drawn from thirst to life, from wandering to arrival. The symbols near the base, the triangles nested together, suggested camp and kin and the circular time of seasons. Elias felt something lift behind his ribs. Not pride, not even comfort, a recognition. If the first relics had shown greed and confession, these showed intention and belonging. The silver veil was not just a hiding place, it was a place that had been honored. He drew the knife from his belt and traced with the flat of the blade and not the edge the line of the winged horse. He did not carve. Some marks should remain untouched. The torch swung again, and the other corner of the chamber answered with its own truth. The light fell across a tangle of shapes on the floor, and the picture built itself a bone at a time. Long white arcs, ribs collapsed like fallen hoops, a scatter of vertebrae, a skull with the jaw askew. Between them, iron and wood had dyed badly, revolver frames furred with rust, knife blades pitted, and eaten a boot heel moldered to rind. Bullet scars puckered the far wall, shallow starbursts in the stone, lead flattened and fused there by speed and heat. Elias lifted the torch, following the pattern, a blind storm of shots, wild and cornered. At the edge of the pile lay a pistol half protected beneath a rock lip. He freed it careful and turned it. Along the barrel, through rust and time, a hand had scratched a name with a nail or a knife-tip bishop. Elias flinched as if stung. The journal had muttered the name like a prayer. One hopes God will not hear, and here the metal spoke it back. Spoke. This was where the Bishop gang's story ended, not in a street with a sheriff's bullet or on a scaffold with a rope, but in a drowned room behind a waterfall no posse would scour. Maybe they followed the thief to the mouth and found no tracks leading in. Maybe they waited outside until thirst made them bold, and then they pushed through the veil to find their quarry in the dark. Maybe shots ricocheted until smoke and screaming broke against the stone, and the last of them fell. God help me. Elias breathed, voice gone small again. This place ain't holy. It's haunted. It was not a metaphor. He felt them there, the panic, the rage, the greedy hope turned to horror. The cave kept every note the world gave it. The water sang over the door and sealed it all. He sank down where he stood, the torchlight slipping as his hand shook. The stone was wet through his trousers, cold enough to make his muscles hitch. He set the torch in a crack again, pinched the bridge of his nose, and let his head hang between his knees until his breath evened. This place ain't just water, he said, more to anchor himself than to claim anything. It's history, or a curse. The flame jittered and threw his words back at him. In its flicker, the three truths set themselves like stones in a circle. The gold the desert had hidden because men couldn't. The paint that had outlived its makers because faith insisted. The bones that said greed had a ledger, and the cave kept accounts. Elias lifted his head and looked at all three in turn. The bars glowed dull, and he felt no hunger for them now, only the weight of what they could buy and ruin. The mural held his eyes, until his heart stopped racing. The bones, though those, dragged his gaze back, honest as consequence. He understood something then that he had only half known when he carved his small mark near the shelter. Silver Veil was not his because he had found it. It would be his only if he could bear what it asked to carry its stories without selling them, to guard its life without claiming its glory, to live with its ghosts without inviting more. Outside, muffled and soft, Dusty whickered. The sound came through rock and water like a thread tugged from another world. It steadied him. It said there was still grass and air and a horse that trusted him on the far side of this breathing stone. He rose, wiped damp from his hands onto his thighs, and took one last look at the chamber. He did not pocket a coin. He did not chip a flake of paint. He laid Bishop's pistol back where he'd found it and set the damaged journal gently as if it could still feel atop the ruined chest. Then he pulled the torch free and turned toward the narrow passage and the thunder. The veil hit him with its old fury, mad to keep what lay behind. But he pushed through and came out gasping into moonlit spray. The night air smelled clean enough to drink. Dusty stood where Elias had left him, head high, eyes white in the dark. When Elias reached him, the gelding nosed the torch aside and pressed his forehead into the man's chest as if to push the cave out of him. Elias laughed once, then choked on it and slid his free arm around the horse's neck. He buried his face in Dusty's mane and let the wet hair cool the heat in his eyes. "It saved us," he said against that living warmth. He lifted his head and looked at the waterfall with new eyes, at the way it slipped from black rock like a bright blade at the mist that rose to blur stars. Gratitude hit him hard enough to sway him. So did fear. Now we guard it. Whatever it is. He led Dusty back to the fire ring, set the torch in the earth to burn itself down, and fed the embers until small flames woke and began their easy talk. He sat the horse standing over him like a sentry and watched the silver sheet fall and fall and fall. The road behind him, the life ahead, both felt changed by what lay in the hollow of the cliff. He knew he could never speak of the bars without summoning ruin, never speak of the bones without inviting law and vengeance, never describe the painting without turning a shrine into spectacle. Silence, then. Not the desert silence that kills, but a chosen one that keeps. When sleep finally came, it came slow and light. Elias lay with his hand resting against Dusty's fetlock and his eyes half open to the fire. The waterfall's lullaby folded the valley into itself. And in that sound, he heard the shape of his future as unchosen and undeniable as the fall of water. Not a wanderer anymore, not exactly. A watcher, a keeper. Morning would come. Men might come someday. If they did, he would be here. Until then, the silver veil would remain what it had been for longer than his kind had counted years, a secret that asked to be carried and a promise that asked to be kept.